Welcome everybody for the today open seminar, the evolution of the network-based cybersecurity. The title is I'm Cheetah from Miss Sweden University, and I am the assistant professor at the computer engineering. And this open lecture where we talk about the network-based cybersecurity and the trend, and it will be presented by the Anders Lindén, who is the head of the research at the Clavister. If you have any question, feel free to submit the question to our mantic.com using the code 62977147, and you can also see the information on the screen. And you can put the question during the presentation, and we will collect all of the question, and we will ask the presenter after the presentation. And now is the time to hand over the talk to the Andra. The floor is all yours, Andra.
Thank you for having me. Today we're going to talk about the evolution of network-based cybersecurity. My name is Anders Lindén. I work as head of research at Clavister. So let's get started. We'll start off by talking about the definition of cybersecurity. The National Institute of Standards and Technology in the US has this definition of cybersecurity. I won't bore you by reading all of it, but you can quickly see that it's a quite broad topic. And I will not cover all aspects of cybersecurity today. Rather, I will focus on the key evolutionary steps within cybersecurity and specifically network-based cybersecurity. So let's get started. In the early days of networking, cybersecurity was primarily focused on protecting the physical infrastructure, meaning securing the hardware and the wires that made up the network, as well as preventing unauthorized access to these network devices and the sensitive data stored on these devices. But one of the earliest and most important tools in network-based cybersecurity was the introduction of the firewall. And the perimeter firewall is a type of network security device that is designed to protect an organization's internal network from unauthorized access from external networks, such as the internet. And the perimeter firewall is placed at the edge of an organizational network, where it acts as a gateway between the internal network and the internet in this case. And it's a really important first line of defense against cyber attacks, and it works in the way that it can monitor and inspect incoming and outgoing traffic, and can filter that according to set policies or rules to control which traffic is allowed and which is not. This is a very early aspect of network-based cybersecurity and was really the first active security device that you put in a network. At this time, the network were really local. You had your devices, your workstation were fixed in the network, and you had one connection out to the external world. So this was the main point of defense, actually, to protect your internal network from any external threats. Another evolutionary step in network-based cybersecurity was the introduction of virtual private networks. It allowed remote users to access internal network resources. So you could work from another location and connect over the internet and establish a secure and encrypted communication channel to your organizational network. But it also provided the capability to connect two different physical locations, two different networks between each other to be able to communicate and this over a shared medium like the internet, bringing down the costs of access as internet access became more and more affordable compared to dedicated leased lines. Another important step was the introduction of antivirus software. Antivirus software has had a significant impact on cybersecurity protection since its inception, basically in the late 80s. Software is designed to detect and prevent malicious software, such as malware, from infecting computers or networks. And it can do this by scanning files and programs for known virus signatures, and can quarantine these files so they can't really infect the network or the computer. These early cybersecurity measures were effective in their time and the way you built networks at that time, but they weren't really designed to handle the more sophisticated and varied threats that would emerge in the years to come. And just looking back the last 20-25 years, there's been a major sort of evolution in the way we build networks, and the drive of this was the digitalization of society. Basically everything being connected. And as the internet grew in popularity and more devices became connected to networks, the cybersecurity landscape began to change. It was really an explosion of the number of connected devices on networks. And with more devices connected to networks, there were more potential entry points for attackers to exploit. These new threats required more advanced security measures to combat them. And one such security feature that was introduced was intrusion detection and prevention system. They monitor network traffic for signs of suspicious activity, such as abnormal network traffic or patterns of behavior that may indicate an attack. And you can deploy intrusion detection and prevention systems either as a network-based solution or as a host-based solution, where the network-based solution is deployed at strategic points within your network. So it can scan any traffic that flows through. Typically, you can use it to protect certain resources such as file servers or web servers or any other important internal service or even external service. Whereas host-based deployments are focused on protecting the device that it's deployed on, and just that device, and monitor any traffic going to and from that device. Another important evolution was the introduction of security information and event management systems. The purpose of these systems is to collect and analyze security-related data from across the network to be able to provide a more holistic view of the security posture of the organization. And there was a need for this because of the fact that the networks became more and more complex. You had different zones with different resources deployed. You had different security components installed, and you couldn't really have a good holistic overview unless you had a single point which can collect information from all these different devices in network and aggregate that into a more understandable view or picture of the current state. But there are two key trends that really changed the cybersecurity landscape, and those two key trends were virtualization and cloud-based services. Starting off with virtualization, virtualization is the process of creating a virtual instance or a virtual version of something it could be a server or an operating system or a storage device. And this allowed organizations to consolidate their infrastructure around multiple virtual machines on a single physical server. And this of course led to a more cost-efficient operation where you could utilize your hardware resources in a better way. Virtualization offered many benefits, but it also presented new security challenges. Traditional firewalls weren't really designed to handle the dynamic and disputed nature of virtual environments. And this led to the emergence of new tools, such as virtual firewalls. And that's software-based firewalls that can be deployed within the virtualized environment. So if you have multiple virtual machines on a physical server, you can also deploy your security components in this virtualized environment as well. As organizations began to shift their operations to cloud-based services, the security landscape continued to evolve. And with cloud services, the data and applications were no longer stored on local devices or servers that were maintained by the people maintaining the local network, but rather on remote servers maintained by a third-party provider. And this shift brought new challenges in securing the cloud-based services and protecting sensitive data in transit. But the benefit of cloud-based services was the cost efficiency. You no longer had to spend a lot of time and resources maintaining a local server installation, keeping it up to date and maintaining all the storage aspects of such a solution. But to combat this challenge of that the data is no longer stored locally and you need to transport the data to and from the cloud, some new solutions were introduced to combat these new threats. One such solution was the introduction of cloud access security brokers. And that's a platform that you position between an organization's on-premise infrastructure and the cloud provider's infrastructure. And it can you can set policies then how you're allowed to use the cloud service in a very detailed fashion. It can provide also data loss prevention capabilities to control and ensure that you don't lose data and you don't leak data to parties that should not have access to this data. It also introduced the need for an increased use of encryption to protect data in transit and at rest. For a long time, a lot of communication on the internet was really unencrypted. You had the websites which were unencrypted, but today we moved into a fully end-to-end encryption model where the majority of services have some end-to-end encryption using technologies such as SSL and TLS. Moving on to today then, let's talk a little bit about the threat landscape. When talking about the threat landscape, it's important to understand the main threat actors. Who is actually trying to do something bad? And there are different categories of threat actors that might have different purpose or different reasons to create or attack networks or access resources. One such actor is what's defined as cyber criminals, and that's individuals or groups who use digital technology to conduct illegal activities. And these are often motivated by financial gain, that they can earn money by creating attacks or basically steal information and sell this information to other people that want to get told this information. So I think a lot of the criminal activity is funded by some form of cyber crime in the background. So this is a very large group today of cyber criminals actively earning money by doing attacks of different kinds. But then you also have state-sponsored hackers, and these are individuals or groups that are backed by some type of government, and they are then involved in espionage or cyber attacks against other nations and/or organizations. And these state-sponsored hackers are often very capable in terms of resources. They can create attacks in a totally different way than a cyber criminal could, because of the financial backing that state-sponsored hackers have. I will later on talk about one such strategy that a state-sponsored hacker can use that involves a lot more resources and dedication and planning. So I'll get back to that a bit later. Another actor is hacktivists, individuals or groups that use hacking as a form of activism to promote their political or social agenda. But then you also have insiders. You can group that into two different categories, either malicious insiders, which are individuals who have access to a corporate environment and decide to turn against their employers by either directly doing something or by helping another threat actor. And this is usually motivated by financial gain or even possibly revenge due to some activity or some reason for not wanting to work at that organization no longer, or being forced out or whatever. But then you have the incautious insider, which is regular employees that they may not have malicious intent, but they may end up causing a data breach due to carelessness, clicking on the wrong links in emails, or installing the wrong software, or leaking information to another threat actor, or being fooled by a threat actor. Finally, this category or threat actor category that's called script kiddies. These are more amateur hackers who use pre-made tools and scripts to carry out attacks. They don't necessarily know exactly what they are doing. They just use a tool they know will work towards a specific target environment. And their motivation might be just because it's fun or to get credibility within the market of hacking. But typically this is very low resource activities, so using pre-made tools, whereas a state-sponsored hacker typically work in a completely different way and create their own tools and their own exploits based on knowledge they gather over time. Moving on then to talk more about attack strategies. So how are these attacks created? What type of attacks are actually used by these threat actors? One common attack is phishing attacks. It's typically involved the use of email or any other messaging platform to trick individuals into providing sensitive information or to download malicious software. Malware. We talked earlier about antivirus software that could protect against the early types of malware. Nowadays, malware is quite complex, but in general, the term malware definition of the term of malware is a type of software that's designed to cause harm computer system or network or device. And it can be regular viruses or Trojans or ransomware, which has been last couple of years. Ransomware has been very talked about in the media, where you actually have a malware that encrypts your data on the device which is infected, and then you need to pay a ransom to get access to this data, and that really puts a heavy load on the networking administration to ensure that they have good backup strategies in place and that these backup strategies actually work. Because if they can't restore the data from backups, they might be forced to pay the ransom. And by paying the ransom, you fund continued work in this area and continued attacks or use of ransomware. And ransomware is a very common way for cyber criminals to earn money today. You also have denial of service attacks, and these attacks involve overloading a network or a system with traffic or requests in order to disrupt its normal function and deny regular users to access the service by the use of an overload attack. Today, you can buy these types of attacks as a service online. So anyone can basically pay a sum of money and then have the capability to trigger a denial of service attack. And it's not that costly either. So this is a very real threat. And basically, any threat actor can do a denial of service attack today with fairly limited resources. So it's really important to have a strategy how you handle denial of service attacks, because they are very common today. Another strategy is credential theft. This can be done in a couple of different ways. You can do password cracking involving software tools that try to guess or crack user passwords. You can use social engineering to try to trick users into revealing their login credentials or send phishing emails and try to get them to log into a mock-up fake page, so you give away your credentials. Or brute force attacks. And brute force attacks works in a way that you try every possible combination of usernames and passwords until you found the correct one. You use dictionaries for this, common words and phrases, etc. But another strategy is, one thing I would say about credential theft is that the introduction of multi-factor authentication is currently the best way to protect against credential theft. And nowadays, you typically talk about you shouldn't really use passwords at all. It's better to use multiple other factors, whether it's something physically tied to you, like your fingerprint or Face ID, in combination with something else to establish your identity, rather than using usernames and passwords. Because usernames and passwords can be leaked, can be stolen, but it's harder to steal multiple different factors, such as your fingerprint or Face ID, in combination with a username or an application on your phone or something like that. Moving on to man-in-the-middle attacks. This is a network-based attack where you intercept traffic or communication between two parties. So you have techniques where you can try to act as if you have a client to server communication, you can try to act as the server and bridge the communication between the client and the server, and create a man-in-the-middle attack, so you can actually see all of the communication between these two parties, even though it appears to be encrypted from the client's perspective. depending on the encryption schemes used, etc. Some of these schemes or algorithms today are susceptible to man-in-the-middle attacks. So it can still appear as your connection is encrypted, but you actually have a man-in-the-middle situation where someone is looking at your communication unencrypted. Going back to social engineering, social engineering in general involves the use of physical manipulation to trick individuals into revealing sensitive information or taking actions that might compromise a system's security. Much like you do social engineering with the physical security, that you let someone through the door that shouldn't really come through the door. Same thing in the digital world, that you might do certain activities triggered by someone talking into it. So you should really think twice and figure out, okay, is this what I should be doing, or are there more established processes or means that you should follow, rather than just trying to be helpful and solve the problem. That might not be the best way to handle it because of the risk of social engineering. We also have zero-day exploits. These are vulnerabilities in software or systems that are either known or unknown to the vendor or developers. You might have a known vulnerability in software, and there might already be a patch for it, but the administrator of that system might not have installed the latest version, so you might not be protected. So then it's a very well-known vulnerability that can be exploited by an attacker. So typically with zero-day attacks, they scan for known vulnerabilities and try to attack before the software has been fixed and upgraded. So it's a window of opportunity which attackers try to use to exploit the vulnerabilities to gain unauthorized access or steal sensitive information. And then finally, you have something that's called advanced persistent threats. And that's a type of attack that is often carried out by more highly skilled and well-funded threat actors, such as state-sponsored hackers. And they can use more sophisticated techniques to gain access to a network or an organization network and remain undetected for an extended period of time. And then they can steal information or intellectual property over time. And I'll get back to a little bit more on how that could possibly be achieved via a state-sponsored threat actor. But with all of these actors and attack strategies, how should you really handle this? How do you mitigate this problem? What is your cybersecurity strategy? There are multiple strategies you can consider. Personally, I feel that it's one aspect of this that you always need to consider. And that's the fact that you should assume that your network will be breached. Today, it's not a matter of if. It will happen at some point in time. If you have a dedicated enough threat actor, that actor will find a way in. So it's better to shift your focus into understanding how can you actually limit the impact of a breach. Yes, of course, you need to have the preventive cybersecurity systems in place as well to have the base protection, but you can't assume that that's your only line of defense. You need to be able to act once you have a breach and try to limit the impact of that breach. One major trend in network-based cybersecurity today is the concept of zero trust network access. To understand zero trust network access, you can start off by talking about zero trust. The concept of zero trust is that you shouldn't trust anyone. You need to verify everyone. And this in itself, it's a concept or a policy that just as you might have a ID check when entering the office, someone needs to look at your ID and verify that you are who you tell you are. That's a zero trust policy that you need to go through that every day, even though you know this person or you know who it is, but still it's a policy that you need to check the ID every time. There's been a shift in cybersecurity strategies where we started to move away a little bit from just having preventative security tools to more of a detection and response strategy, where we recognize that it's not a matter of if, but when a security breach will occur. And it doesn't really matter how sophisticated this first line of defenses are. You need to assume that attackers will find a way in. And that's when, from a network perspective, you start to realize that the concept of intrinsic trust, that you give broad brushed access to users across devices on a network, is not really a good idea. Just by the fact that you are located on the office network in the office, connected to the port network port in the wall, doesn't mean that traffic that you produce on that port should be trusted. You need to verify the identity of that device or user communicating on that port. So that's where zero trust network access comes in. It's a security framework that eliminates inherent trust and requires strong and regular authentication and authorization of devices and users. Zero trust network access is a term that was coined by Gartner, and it introduced this concept of zero trust into the networking level. But when talking about zero trust network access, you need to talk about identity. And in general, what we talk about today is that identity is the new perimeter. You shouldn't have implicit trust. You always need to verify the identity. And if you bring this into the network security perspective, traditionally, when you have a VPN solution or a software-defined WAN solution, you establish VPN tunnels, and typically you have access to the whole network inside this tunnel. So when I connect to the office, I will have access to all of the resources on the office network. But that's not really a good way to handle it, because if I have a breach on my computer, which then has a connection to the office over this VPN tunnel, perhaps I shouldn't have access to all resources on that network. You have a really big attack surface for any actor that sort of gained access inside of the VPN. So with zero trust networking access, you rather look at sort of from an identity perspective, a user or an identity really should only have access to specific services and service based on their role or how they connect or how they authenticate. So if I'm sitting at home, I might have access to certain resources only. If I sit at office, I still authenticate and prove my identity, but then I might have access to more resources. So really having more granular policies based on more parameters. I might be out traveling abroad, but should I really have access to all the resources I have access to when sitting at the office when I'm traveling abroad? Is that the best policy? You should really try to limit the attack surface and minimize the potential ways of breaching the network, assuming that your identity can at some point be breached. And how do you limit then the impact of that breach? How do you isolate the problem? Minimize the blast radius of potential attack. I will shift focus into AI-based cybersecurity now for a while. AI is a key trend in cybersecurity today, AI and machine learning. Talk about some of the areas where AI and machine learning is heavily used today. One aspect where AI and machine learning is used is the anomaly-based intrusion detection systems. We talked earlier about intrusion detection systems where you had more signature-based ways of detecting attack patterns. When you have anomaly-based intrusion detection systems, you actually learn what the normal network traffic looks like and model the behavior of the normal network traffic. And that way you can identify any deviation from that behavior and find anomalies, which then may be potential threats. So rather than having signatures for known threats, you have a model of the known good behavior, which is then used to identify any deviations in behavior, any anomalies. So it's a very generic detection capability to detect behavioral changes, which is a very much broader and fine-grained way to detect anomalies or attacks. You don't need to know what the attack pattern is. You just need to understand that, okay, when the attack occurs, it will lead to some type of behavioral change on the network. And that's what you can detect them with AI-based intrusion detection systems. Another aspect is behavioral biometrics. You can authenticate users. You can use this behavioral biometric as one factor. So you can look at how you use your keyboard or move the mouse or how you use a touchscreen as one factor in your authentication procedures. Malware detection. Nowadays, moving away from signatures on executables. So you have this executable is bad. It's shown bad behavior before. Then you create a signature of that, and then you try to match all your files. If it matched the signature, then you know it's a bad application. That's not the modern way to handle it. Today, you rather monitor the way the application behaves. Try to find the sort of execution patterns. How does this application access the storage? How does it access operating system features, etc. And this is a response to the evolution of malware, moving from having one fixed executable that sort of has some malicious intent into having an executable that every time you execute this executable, it changes. Polymorphic malware. So you can't really have signature matching any longer as your line of defense. You need to look at, okay, what is this application actually doing? Because every time you run it, it will change its signature or change the executable that is being run. So that's where machine learning and AI has been an evolution in the way how you handle malware today. But you also have analytics where AI can help you to automate log analytics to get better troubleshooting and problem resolution through anomaly detection or root cause analysis, predictive analysis, log classification, and even natural language processing, trying to understand the log events and explain them in more natural way to humans. So finally, I will move into 2 areas of interest for me personally, which I work on a daily basis. One such area is critical infrastructure. With the digitalization we talked about before, there is a lot of critical infrastructure that is controlled and monitored by digital means today, which means that they are sensitive, or it's new attack vectors towards critical infrastructure. Looking at one such example is energy distribution, where you have a power generation facility, which is controlled by some type of controller. You feed this power via the power grid to a substation, which then distributes power to the individual households or parts of cities. These substations today are becoming more and more digitalized. So there's control signaling happening, so you can understand from a power, the sort of power company can understand how the utilization is on a very detailed and fine granular level, understand if there's problems, how widespread is that problem. And it's control signaling happening all the time from these substations to the controller and back. But also the power generation facilities has this control signaling. This control signaling protocols are typically unencrypted today. Yes, you try to mitigate that by having encryption on the transport of these protocols. But you still have the risk of these substations being distributed far out on the edge in society, that you can have a physical breach of a substation. And what can you do if you start to mess around with this control signaling? What can that lead to in terms of the power generation or the power grid in general? It's a quite sensitive network, and it's an area of improvement, I must say. So it's definitely cybersecurity is being pushed out into areas where you traditionally perhaps haven't had this problem statement to work with. And the challenge today in energy distribution in general is the fact that in Sweden, a lot of the power companies are really small. They are either municipality owned or very small power companies, which may not have the resources themselves to handle this problem. So this is an area of concern. There's a lot more standardization happening in this area as well, try to enforce better security in this area. But this is an area where needs to be more work done in general. Another interesting area is defense. The US Department of Defense had a statement in early 2022 that their prediction was that the next large Pearl Harbor-like attack probably wouldn't manifest itself as a lot of bombs destroying ships, but rather digitalized attacks by the use of malware or any other means, idling in the fleet, and then you create a more digital attack with the similar results as a more physical attack, but with a much lower cost to the adversary and also a more unpredictable impact of public opinion due to lack of more visible carnage, more explainable carnage. And we've seen also in the conflicts of today within Europe, in Ukraine, for instance, that a lot of the attacks are combined attacks. You have the physical attacks with bombs and missiles in combination with digital attacks on the power grid, for instance, trying to produce as much disruption as possible. So even if the missile might miss the power generation facility, you have a digital impact on the power grid instead. Within defense, I talked earlier about the state-sponsored hacker. And state-sponsored hackers have a lot more resources, and they can utilize other means of attacks. And supply chain attacks is one such example, where you have a component manufacturer that's being impacted by the fact you might have someone working for that component manufacturer that actually introduce some malicious code in the software of that component. So already from the factory of that component, when the military platform manufacturer receives the component, it verifies the component in its system, and it acts fully normal. But it's then brought out into the military system of systems and given any type of trigger, whether it's a location-based trigger or some radio trigger or whatever type of trigger you can come up with, might trigger then a malicious act of this component. And this component may be, for instance, a very simple component on the canvas of a vehicle, controlling something very simple as the blinkers lights or whatever it may be, something very, very simple and stupid on the vehicle. But the fact that this communication system or this network, this canvas network, the way it's built, if you're connected to the canvas, you can communicate with anyone on that canvas. So this component, that its main intent was to handle the blinkers on this military vehicle. If you have a change of behavior of that component, it can start to attack the engine. So given any type of trigger, you can start to attack the vehicle from within. And this leads to the need to introduce more of the zero trust concept into the internal military platforms as well. And this is an active area of research for me at Clavister, where we look at more concepts how to mitigate this problem. How do you minimize the impact of this type of problem? Where we use artificial intelligence for monitoring of these components to detect when a behavioral change is happening. I will close off by talking about some key trends. One key trend is the increased use of AI and machine learning, as we talked about. There are many ways AI and machine learning can improve cybersecurity. And a lot of the research is focused on the use of AI and machine learning within cybersecurity today. There's also a growing threat of ransomware. As we've seen in the news the last couple of years, it's a real threat to society, with the attacks in Sweden on Coop, for instance, or any other known ransomware attack. We also have the IoT security challenges, where we have a lot of connected components that themselves might be quite simple in nature, and they don't really have a good security in itself. They may be very, very simple in how they are produced. And it's a risk because they are connected in a network. But that's where you have the zero trust concepts you can work with to try to isolate and ensure that this component can only talk to the right components in the network. Another trend is cybersecurity as a service. Given the complex nature of cybersecurity and the move of services to the cloud, it's natural that you move also your cybersecurity needs into the cloud as well. And you actually have someone managing that for you, an expert in the area managing your cybersecurity solutions rather than deploying that in-house managed by you or your IT department. There's also a focus on data privacy. Breaches have become more common, and there's a growing focus on how to protect personal information. And this involves new regulations such as GDPR within Europe. But finally, a trend is the cybersecurity skills gap. There's a shortage of skilled cybersecurity professionals. And this makes it difficult for organizations to protect themselves against cyber threats. And this proves the need or more training programs and initiatives to encourage more people to enter this field, but also to produce more managed services. You shouldn't perhaps have your own IT department handling your cybersecurity because of the complex nature of these threats today. But finally, you can conclude by saying that cybersecurity threats are constantly evolving. And it's important for individuals and organizations to stay up to date with the latest trends and best practices to protect against cyber attacks. And that's all I had for today. Thank you.
Thanks for the presentation. And Orion, if you have any question, please submit to our menti.com for the question if you want to ask. And meanwhile, when we're waiting for the question, I would like to introduce about the our coursework. And this is the this was the part of the first lecture for that Applied Network Security course. And in here, we will focus on the different kind of attacks and different kind of tools and practical skills for the professional for the security. And also in this this course is ongoing and still open for the registration. That's why if you are interested in this Applied Network Security course, and if you want to learn more about the network security based on the first course, please register at the website antagning.se, and there's the coursework code is MIU-F23252. And in here, you can apply this coursework if you have the BSc degree in computer engineering or similar. And also you need to have the basic background for the programming. So please try to apply for this coursework if you are interested in network security. Now we have a few questions for the presenter. The first question is that, is there any community where they give updates about the new tracks? That is the one question from the audience.
Yeah, there are many collaborative efforts. Possibly can't name them directly, but there are many areas where you can collaborate. I know there exist areas within Sweden, for instance, for organizations that can join. For instance, it's called Cybernode in Sweden, managed by RISE, and that's good collaboration where you can join as an organization and get more updates on cybersecurity and threats. So if you're interested, look up the Cybernode. That's one example, but of course there exists a lot of different more market-specific areas. Within defense, it's the SOF organization, for instance, has really good collaboration on cybersecurity. But I know there exists a lot of these also within the energy sector. There's similar organizations that that try to collaborate on this topic, trying to sort of ensure that there's some support out there to help organizations to handle this problem in the best way possible. So yeah, you should really look up within your area of the market what type of organizations are there and how they can support you.
Yeah, thank you for the first question. Now I would like to move to second question. This is about what are some potential challenges that may arise during the integration of the artificial intelligence or machine learning into the network-based cybersecurity, and how can they be addressed?
Yeah, there's a lot of challenges in general with artificial intelligence and machine learning. One such key problem, I would say, is data privacy. So depending on what type of information you handle, Clavister work on the network level, and we typically do not apply machine learning and AI on the actual payload, what you transport, but we rather look at how you communicate, look in the IP headers and things like that. So it's not that sensitive information, but I think in general, you need to always have a strategy on how you look at the data you use for artificial intelligence and machine learning. How do you handle that data? How you need a lot of data typically to train machine learning or AI models. But there exists a lot of different techniques for this. And for instance, Clavister works with a technique which allows us to train directly on the device where it's deployed in the network. So we don't need to export data. And that's really helpful, for instance, within defense, where they typically consider all of the information being sensitive in some form. So having a model where you need to extract data from a system to train a model and then feed back the model, that's a bit complex then due to regulations and sensitivity of information. But then if you can rather train directly on the platform where it's deployed, this technique, then you get rid of a lot of these problems. So that's a really concrete example of how you can try to find sort of different ways to address the problem to solve or mitigate these problems coming up with handling of data. But then in general, with artificial intelligence, there's a lot of talk about, okay, how can you protect artificial intelligence from attacks? How can you ensure that you're not feeding the AI with data that's is trying to fool the AI? So that's an area of research, as well as an area of research being looking at more biased AI. So perhaps if you have a decision-making AI, perhaps you don't like that AI to make decisions which are not biased in any direction. That's also an area of heavy research. So I wouldn't say that all problems are solved, far from, but it's a really active research community trying to work with these problems going forward. But I think data privacy, I know in the field of medicine, data privacy, that problem is it's a real sort of blocker for introducing AI in that field, because you need to anonymize all of the information and all the process of handling that. And that's perhaps is the larger problem than the actual AI technology itself. So but it's a lot of active work in that area. So I think there will be solutions to it moving forward. But I think that's sort of, privacy is the main concern, I would say, and biased AI.
The final question is that cloud is more secure as compared to on-premise if we talk about the cybersecurity as the service. this is the last question.
Yeah, I would say like this: if you decide to use a cloud service instead of something locally managed, it can be more secure. Yes, because the cloud service, assume that it's managed by an expert of that system. You should look this up. How do you treat cybersecurity for that cloud service before you decide to use it? But if they state that they have certain measures in place to protect your data and communication to the service, then I think they can do a better job of keeping that service up to date compared to you deploying your own server internally and maintain that server and keep it up to date and have the best practices in terms of how you configure a database. There's a lot of aspects associated with keeping a system secure that typically can be done better in a cloud service because you have experts working on it rather than a general IT admin deploying all the systems internally. But there still exist reasons why perhaps you want to have your systems internally and rather work with zero trust, as we talked about, to ensure that you have very strict control on who can actually talk to this service. And you decide to have it locally because you don't want any data to leave your network. So I would say it's very much a hybrid environment that perhaps you should consider some services still to be local if you have the means to maintain them. But if you don't really have a IT team which have the knowledge to maintain the service in a good way in a cybersecurity with a cybersecurity perspective, then you should consider to move to cloud services instead.
Thank you for the answer. And as a conclusion, I would like to introduce again about our open lecture. And this open lecture is the ongoing, and the registration process is still opening. So if you are interested in this open lecture, please register at the website. And also at the same time, this coursework is especially for the full employed in the full time, and also you can apply this coursework at the antagning.se with the course code MIU-F2352. And if you have the BSc degree in computer engineering or similar, and if you have the programming background, you can apply for this coursework. And thank you very much for the question, and also thank you very much to the presenters.
Thank you.